This book, it's a little different from past books in which I take a number of very common um, contemporary controversies, and I use psychological principles to try and make sense of things that are in the news right now.
Also in the book, you mention the topic of change. So since your first book was published in 2000, how would you say you have changed both as a person and as a writer?
Well, I know more. I'm way older. I've well, the big difference is that I about 4 years ago began to do a podcast called Revisionist History, which is a very different kind of journalistic undertaking. The balance of your own voice and other people's voices changes. You're really spending a lot more time listening to people than you are talking. In a book, it's you. Boom, 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 with occasional quotes. In a podcast, it's reversed. It's somebody else talking, and then you're kind of filling in and so that really affected the way this book was written.
And then the book also touches on the topic of trust, how one can and does choose to trust a stranger. And you mentioned in one interview that your readers trust you as an author, as a researcher, and you joked that maybe it's because you're Canadian and you're easy to trust. But why are countless people willing to trust an author such as yourself when you are a complete stranger and they may know nothing about you?
Yeah. Well, there's two ways to answer that question. One is that, and I talk about this in the book, as human beings, we are hardwired to trust everyone. We're trusting machines. That's why we evolved as dramatically as we did. That's why we're able to create, extraordinary civil society and modern civilization and build companies and run universities. It's because our first impulse when we meet with someone, even if it's someone we don't know, is to trust them. We need to trust in order to have a functioning society, but it means that every now and again we're going to get deceived. And we need to be fine with that. We need to accept the fact that sometimes it doesn't work. So why do people trust me? Well, they trust me because all of us trust everyone.
You're an author, but you're also a journalist. You're also a podcast host and creator. And I heard you're an athlete running a sub 5-minute mile when you were 51 when you were 51 in 2014. That said, how do you define yourself? What is your overall title?
Oh, I just call myself a journalist. I think that covers everything except the running.
Right.
I don't think of, these days, that word describes a whole series of different activities. It used to be very narrowly that a journalist was someone who worked for a magazine or a newspaper. But now I think there's so many new forms of media that it's just someone who is engaged in the project of explaining things to a broad audience.
And then when David Remnick interviewed you, you said your typical reader is a 45-year-old guy with 3 kids who's an engineer, and he's probably read 2 of your books, listened to your podcasts. How much consideration for your audience might perceive your work goes into crafting a book or a podcast or anything, really?
Well, not so much now, because now I've been doing this so long that I know that people know who I am, and they may have read one or more of my books or listened to my podcast. So I'm confident now that if I'm interested in something, my audience is probably interested in it too.
And then going back to defaulting to truth, you say in your book that people usually believe at first only what they want to believe. It's just a common human phenomenon. How can we best stop doing that?
If somebody says they're 45 years old and drive a Honda Civic, the first thing out of my mouth is not, I don't believe you. The first thing out of my mouth is, okay, you're 45 and you drive a Civic. And until I see your birth certificate and discover you're 61, I'm going to believe you're 45. And until I see you driving down the highway in a Porsche, I'm going to believe you drive a Honda Civic, right? That's the kind of, and I think that's not something we want to mess with. I think the consequences of turning ourselves into paranoid, skeptics are serious and terrible, it's a good thing that we are fundamentally credulous about what other people tell us, so long as we accept the fact that 1 out of 100 times somebody's going to pull the wool over our eyes.
Well, that makes sense. Well, I think that's all we have for you, but thank you very much again for taking the time to speak with us, and we
Not at
really
all.
appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.